A soldier came home, but no one saluted. That's how it began. He wasn't in uniform anymore. He was just a man with a worn blazer and shoes shined too well for a commercial airport. His eyes, sunken but sharp, had that deep, unreadable hue, the kind you only see in those who've said too many goodbyes. When the gate agent at Terminal C looked up and saw him standing there, ticket in hand, her gaze passed over him like water over stone. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. She barely blinked. "ID, please," she said, monotone, barely audible over the ambient announcements and rolling suitcases. He handed her a military ID, edges frayed, photo faded but intact. The scanner gave a sharp beep. Not a good one, a red flash. Her face tightened, not in apology, but irritation, the kind reserved for those who make her job slightly less seamless. "Sir," she began. The "sir" hollow. "Procedural. This ID isn't compliant with federal regulations. We require a real ID or an approved secondary." Her fingers already hovered above her keyboard for the next passenger. "I'm afraid I can't let you board." He didn't argue. That was the strange part. No protest, no questions. He nodded once, not out of agreement, but the kind of nod a soldier gives when a plan goes south and there's no time to mourn it. His name was Raymond Holt. He stepped back slowly, as if retreating from a minefield, and walked toward the edge of the terminal seating area, near the vending machines. Nobody followed him with their eyes. Nobody noticed his patch 101st Airborne stitched into the shoulder seam of his blazer. He sat down, hat on his lap. It had a small tear on the brim, the kind of wound you don't bother to fix. Like a scar you've come to. The bench was cold. Metal on his back reminded him of the time he'd leaned against a Huey's landing skid for 2 hours during a surprise jungle drop. But that was decades ago. Now he was just a man on a bench. One passenger among hundreds. Forgotten. The ticket was paid for. A veterans charity had arranged a round trip to Arlington for a ceremony on Veterans Day. He was to lay a wreath. Just 3 left from Echo Recon 6. One was too frail to travel. The other had passed a month earlier. So Raymond was the last. But none of that mattered now. The woman at the gate hadn't asked. The system hadn't cared. He didn't pull out a phone, he didn't own one. Instead, he opened a folder from his blazer pocket. Inside were 2 forms of ID, a printed itinerary, and an index card where he had scribbled in careful penmanship. "Excuse me, I may need help locating my gate. I'm traveling to D.C. for a military ceremony." He'd written it just in case his words got tangled. Just in case people didn't listen. Just in case his voice, steady but low, didn't carry through the digital din of airport noise. That moment, that quiet man in a pressed blazer, reading an old letter by the vending machines, that's where the story should have ended. And it would have, if not for a teenage boy named Kyle. He wasn't paying attention at first. Like everyone else, he was absorbed in his phone, scrolling, switching tracks, waiting for his delayed flight to nowhere important. But something about the way Raymond sat straight, unmoving, like he was waiting for a command, made Kyle look up again. He saw the shine on the man's shoes, almost the trembling hand that held a folded paper. The way his jaw clenched, not from anger, but habit. The kind of stillness that didn't come from fatigue. It came from discipline. Without thinking, Kyle lifted his phone and snapped a photo. One, not posed, not intrusive, just the man, the bench, the silence around him. He posted it on Reddit in a Veterans Appreciation subreddit. Caption: "They wouldn't let him fly." He said, "It's okay. I've been left behind before." That line. That's what cracked the silence. It wasn't a complaint. It was a truth too heavy to ignore. Within minutes, the photo spread. A former Army captain saw it in a lounge in D.C. She forwarded it to a closed Department of Defense group. An Air Force pilot recognized the name from the post Holt. Raymond, and remembered a story from the academy. A legendary escape. 12 days in hostile terrain with no radio. Navigation by stars and instinct. A name passed down in whispers, not for medals, but for leadership. Meanwhile, Raymond remained still. A gate agent passed by, gave him a glance, kept walking. His plane began boarding, row by row. Nobody called his name. Nobody came to ask. The letter in his hand, handwritten by a retired general, reminded him why he came. The last line etched in looping cursive: "If you can make it, We'll be waiting at the stones. Bring the coin. We saved you a spot. That coin, a challenge coin forged for Echo Recon 6, lay nestled in a hand-stitched pouch sewn inside his lapel. He hadn't touched it in years. Now he placed a thumb over it, just enough pressure to remind himself it was still there, still real. Then a sound not from the PA system, not from the gate, from the tower. Quiet at first, then clearer, channeled through backlines only a few remembered still existed. All personnel at Gate 32, please pause operations. You are in the presence of Staff Sergeant Raymond Holt, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, and former unit commander of Echo Recon 6. This man flies today, and he flies free. That is not a request. That is an order. The gate froze. Time seemed to stall mid-sentence. A boarding pass half torn in a traveler's hand remained suspended. The young agent at the desk looked up. She blinked. Then again, she stared at her screen, then to the man on the bench. He hadn't moved. But his eyes had changed. For the first time, they held something else. Recognition, or maybe just the beginning of it. Sir, the agent stammered, her voice no longer robotic. Would you please come forward? He stood. No haste, no pride, just precision, like he had a rank to carry, a code to honor. His gait was steady, even with the slight limp, step by step, through the center of the terminal. No one clapped, no one cheered, but every conversation stopped. No one had told them to be silent, but they were because somewhere, somehow, instinct said, this matters. A captain in full dress uniform appeared at the gate door. No ceremony, just a deep nod, one soldier to another, and Raymond nodded back barely, just enough to say, acknowledged. The ticket was gone. They tore it. The gate unlocked, not with a beep, but by hand. Before he boarded, Raymond paused, looked back once, not at the crowd, but at the bench, as if thanking it for keeping him still, keeping him ready. He said only 5 words. Sorry for holding up boarding, but no one minded now. Not anymore. Because something deeper had just arrived. Not a man, but a memory the nation almost forgot. And just like that, Raymond Holt, the man left behind, was airborne. End of chapter 1. At 31,000 feet, the seat next to the cockpit wasn't designed for comfort. It wasn't even padded. Just a narrow jump seat bolted to the bulkhead, facing sideways toward the instrument panel and flight crew. But Raymond didn't complain. He never did. He sat upright, hands folded on his lap, legs slightly angled from an old injury, the kind that doesn't ache anymore unless rain or memory brings it back. The young first officer, maybe 27 at most, glanced sideways every so often as if to confirm this was truly happening. Raymond noticed, but said nothing. What would he even say that once, in the canopy of Laos, he'd held a man's artery closed with 2 fingers for 11 hours. That silence, when earned, is louder than shouting, ho. He just looked ahead, through the tiny side window, out into the vastness where cloud met sky, where everything was white and without judgment. He didn't speak until 20 minutes into the flight, and when he did, it wasn't to reminisce. The pilot had turned slightly and asked softly, Sir, is this your first time back in the air since? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Raymond gave a single nod. Then, quietly, he said, I flew out in 72. Commercial. One way. Came home different. That was all. Nothing dramatic. Just facts carried in the kind of voice you only hear from men who've stopped expecting to be understood. Below them, land passed in soft patterns, like forgotten maps drawn by memory alone. But Raymond wasn't looking down. He was remembering. He didn't want to, but it came anyway. That last flight in 72. That feeling of being too young to retire. Too old to be afraid. The moment when the flight attendant had asked if he wanted coffee, and he'd flinched because her hand had come from his blind side too fast. That old muscle, the one trained to react, had shuddered. He hadn't flown since, not because he was afraid, but because the ground, even when shaky, had never betrayed him. Back in economy, a passenger had overheard the cockpit conversation, only bits and pieces. But enough. Word began to spread. A young woman in row 19 sent a text to her father, a retired Marine. He texted his entire VFW chat group. Within minutes, the plane became a corridor of quiet signals text, whispers, glances, not of curiosity, but of reverence. The name Holt now echoed like something ancient and dignified. Someone pulled up his name on a military archive site, a bronze star, a silver star, a dozen lesser-known citations for field decisions that had saved dozens of lives and never made headlines. One of the flight attendants, with eyes now watery, brought him a cup of black coffee without asking. She placed it gently on the fold-down tray and simply said, "For the long road, Sergeant." He nodded, looked at the coffee, and let it sit. He didn't drink it. Not yet. He was remembering too much. Meanwhile, the ground wasn't idle. The viral post was now exploding, picked up by several veteran advocacy pages, then shared by a retired general with over 200,000 followers. The algorithm had caught fire, but the true engine was human. Memory, guilt, pride, recognition. Stories started pouring in. He was my dad's CO in Nam. Saved his unit in a night raid. He taught us how to navigate with shadows and silence. He never accepted promotion to major. Said he didn't want to be too far from the boys. One by one, memories like these formed an invisible trail behind Raymond's flight path, a kind of honor escort you couldn't see on radar. At Joint Base Andrews, an operations tech named Darnell saw the post during his break. He didn't say a word, just stood up and walked to the tarmac scheduling room. "We need to notify Arlington," he said. The colonel on duty didn't ask why. He just nodded. The quiet chain had begun. No lights, no sirens, just deliberate movement. Back on the plane, Raymond had opened a thin, creased booklet, a kind of personal Bible, though not religious. Inside were photos, all black and white, tucked between notes and letters. One photo showed 9 men in full gear, standing waist-deep in rice water, grinning like they'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. One of them was missing 2 front teeth. Another had his helmet backwards. They were boys, but they were already ghosts. Raymond stared at the picture longer than necessary. Not because he needed to remember them, but because he didn't want to forget the weight of their faces. "Sir," the captain leaned in gently from the cockpit. "We've been asked to hold 5 minutes before landing." Arlington requested what? Something about runway sequencing. But that wasn't true. The 5-minute hold was to allow the coordination of an unscheduled, silent honor arrival. Something rarely used. Something the FAA kept in place out of respect, though it hadn't been called upon in decades. When the plane finally touched down, it wasn't the usual rubber screech and applause. There was no noise. Passengers didn't rise. The captain's voice came on, calm and slow. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated for a moment. Today we have the honor of flying with Staff Sergeant Raymond Holt. This is not a delay, this is recognition." The click of seatbelts unlocking never came. Everyone stayed frozen, eyes forward. And Raymond, he rose, slowly, carefully, as though every bone had a name, and he was saying goodbye to each of them one last time. As he walked down the aisle, not one phone was raised, not one whisper, just stillness, reverence. The kind you don't orchestrate, the kind that happens only when history passes close enough to brush your sleeve. At the gate, 2 officers in dress blues waited beside a black sedan with no license plates and a folded flag resting silently on the dash. They didn't salute. They didn't need to. The respect was already complete. He stepped into the vehicle, and as it pulled away, passengers slowly began to stand. Not all at once, but like a tide returning to shore. Raymond didn't look back. He didn't wave. But inside the folded pocket of his blazer, the coin pressed gently against his chest, heavier now, warmer somehow, as if every story that had passed through radio signals and message boards in whispered respect had gathered inside it. And on the flight crew's console, a final message had appeared, blinking quietly, in amber: honor transfer complete. Passenger VIP, not override, not optional, final. Raymond sat in the back seat of the sedan and looked out the window as the trees thinned and the marble of Arlington came into view. The air seemed heavier, more exact, like the ground knew it was carrying something sacred. He didn't say a word, but inside, he felt the tension of decades slowly, respectfully, releasing its grip. Not because he had reached his destination, but because, for the first time in years, he hadn't had to walk there alone. The car slowed just before the gates of Arlington. There was no escort, no music, no banner waiting, just air so still it felt pressed in place, the kind of quiet that doesn't need permission to command respect. Raymond shifted slightly in his seat, not to ease the stiffness in his knees, but to adjust the velvet box in his hand. It was smaller than a wallet, faded around the edges, with a brass button that no longer clicked. Inside was the coin, Echo Recon 6. Stamped on it were only the initials, a set of coordinates, and a phrase in Latin most wouldn't recognize. It didn't matter. The men who'd held it knew exactly what it meant. The sedan rolled to a stop beside a long, narrow path where headstones stood in perfect alignment, like sentinels in marble formation. The driver stepped out, circled the car, but before his hand could reach the door handle, Raymond was already pushing it open. He emerged slowly, each joint a protest, but his spine was straight. The officer nearby began to move, offering an arm. Raymond waved him off gently. "I walked out of there carrying two," he said, more to the wind than the man. "I can walk in carrying none." His voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It simply existed, like something too practiced to falter. He took the path alone. No cameras followed, no crowds, just the crunch of gravel beneath old shoes and the steady rhythm of memory. Section 60, that's where they were. Row 47, stones B19 through B26. Each one was like a door he hadn't opened in years. He stopped at the first, Sergeant Alan Boxcar Petrie, the prankster, the one who'd once taped a snake to a captain's cot just to break the tension before patrol. Raymond pressed two fingers to the top of the stone, whispered a name, then moved on. Corporal Jimmy Young, Specialist Will Eyes Grant, stone after stone. He didn't cry. Not because the grief had gone, but because it had settled somewhere deeper, where tears don't reach, where language stops short. He reached the last marker. Lieutenant Jared Owen, the youngest in the unit, but their anchor, the one with the halves always folded too precisely, the handwriting so neat it looked printed. He'd been the first to volunteer for every recon op, the first to defend a mistake that wasn't his, the first to fall. Raymond knelt, not fast, not clean, but with intent. He placed the box on the stone, opened it, and took out the coin. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he said, "I made it." Another pause. "Didn't get there in 72, but I'm here now." His fingers pressed the coin flat against the granite. A quiet click, almost metallic, as it settled into place. Then slowly, painfully, he lifted his right hand and saluted. It wasn't sharp, but it was pure. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, not military, civilian heels, but with weight. Raymond didn't turn at first, but the scent of dust and worn leather drifted forward. A woman stepped beside him. Uniform, yes, but not current issue. A dark blue tailored blazer with ribbons that gleamed under a layer of age. Her hair was salt gray, pulled into a simple knot. Her presence didn't ask for space, it filled it by right. She didn't speak immediately. She waited until Raymond lowered his hand and placed it on the stone for balance. Then she said, "He talked about you." Her voice was controlled, but raw underneath. She didn't need to say who. Raymond glanced up. "Jared." She nodded. "He said you kept him laughing, even in the dark." I tried. She knelt next to him, knees cracking gently under the weight of age and history. "I'm Marion Owens, his sister." He didn't answer right away, just took a breath. Then, "He kept us going longer than we had any right to." "I know." She pulled from her jacket a photo. It was Jared, not in uniform. Just a boy on a dock, holding a fish bigger than his arm span. She placed it beside the coin. "I flew from Brussels when I saw the post." Raymond raised an eyebrow. She nodded. "The flight, Gate 32, I was at NATO HQ. Word spreads fast when it wants to." They stayed like that, kneeling, for several minutes. Then Marion spoke again. "You were the last one left." Raymond gave a half smile, something between sadness and irony. Not anymore. Behind them, they didn't hear the people stop. A groundskeeper pushing a cart slowed. A pair of cadets on a quiet walking tour paused, instinctively standing straighter. A mother guiding her son between rows of stone tapped his shoulder and pointed. "It's the man from the flight," someone whispered. That whisper moved from row to row, section to section, not like rumor, but like reverence. No one shouted. No one called others over. But slowly, quietly, bodies turned, faces watched, not out of curiosity, out of understanding. Marion stood first, then helped Raymond up. "You want a private service?" she asked. He shook his head. "No speeches." They didn't get one. "I don't want one either." She didn't argue. She understood. Instead, she stepped back as he reached into his blazer once more. From the inner lining, he pulled out the folded letter, the same one he'd read at the airport. He tore the bottom section, about a paragraph long, and placed it under a small river stone beside Jared's marker. "To those who remember, you're why we did it," he said, barely more than a whisper. "To those who forget, we did it for you anyway." Then he turned. No ceremony, no command, just a man walking slowly back down the hill, past white markers that caught the afternoon light like rows of timepieces ticking in silence. Each step tapped against the earth with deliberate rhythm. No music played, but if you listened, it sounded like a drumbeat, soft, certain, final. At the gates, one of the cadets snapped to attention. "Saluted, sir, we read about you." Raymond looked at him, young, nervous, eager. He nodded once, then walked on. Upright, steady, proud, no parade, no title. Just a man who had once been denied a seat until a country finally remembered what it owed to the ones who never stopped carrying it. The evening air outside Arlington was heavier than the daylight that had come before it. The sun was setting slowly, casting long, golden shadows across the rows of headstones that now seemed to glow faintly, as if each one held a breath of history, waiting to be exhaled. Raymond walked past them without haste. His steps had grown slower since the hill, but his posture never broke. Behind him, Marion had remained by her brother's grave, her hand resting on the photo she'd left beside the coin. He didn't need to turn to know that she'd lingered. Some grief is better when shared, but some must be carried alone. As he reached the lower path, the driver was still waiting by the black sedan, arms folded behind his back like a sentinel. No one had spoken since the salute. The gate officer opened the car door as Raymond approached, but he didn't enter immediately. He turned, one last time, to face the slope that led back to row 47. And that's when he noticed its scattered groups of people, not in uniform, not in formation, but present, quiet, observing. Not all had seen the flight, not all knew his name, but somehow, word had spread. A small boy stood near Section 58 with his grandfather. The boy clutched a small American flag in one hand and a plastic army figure in the other. The old man pointed gently toward Raymond, whispering something the boy wouldn't remember exactly, but would feel the shape of when he was older. Raymond gave a small nod in their direction and finally entered the car. As the vehicle pulled away, the silence inside was uninterrupted. Not because the driver was unaware of who he carried, but because he knew exactly who he did. Words would only lessen it. They reached the edge of the grounds and paused at the gate. A young officer stepped out of the booth, gave a crisp salute, then turned a switch inside the post. What followed was so subtle that many missed it, a signal to the FAA that the honor transfer protocol had concluded. But what no one expected was what came next. By the time the car reached the quiet government guest house where Raymond was scheduled to stay, something had begun to shift across the country. The photo from the flight had gone further than Reddit. A teacher in Ohio had printed it out and taped it to her classroom door with a note that read, "Remember the price of forgetting." A reporter in Texas found an old training log that mentioned Raymond by name and posted an excerpt of it, alongside a caption that simply read, "This man walked alone until we made room beside him." The ripple effect wasn't a tidal wave. It wasn't loud. It was deeper than that, quieter. Yes, but steadier. That night, in cities he'd never seen and homes he'd never enter, people looked up his name. Some posted tributes. Others sat with their own memories. Veterans who hadn't spoken in years reached out to friends, just to say they remembered. One man, now in his 80s, pulled out his own challenge coin and placed it on his nightstand. He stared at it until sleep found him. In a small diner outside Boise, a young waitress brought a coffee to a man in a worn veteran's cap and said, "It's covered. For Staff Sergeant Holt." The man blinked, then nodded. He didn't know Holt personally, but now he did. Back in D.C., Raymond sat in a small room, the kind the government reserves for honored guests. Not luxurious, but clean. Functional. Respectful in its simplicity. A wooden chair. A narrow bed with hospital corners. A desk with an old lamp and two folded towels. He stood at the window, watching the street lamp flicker. In his hands was the note Marion had handed him before they parted. It wasn't long, just a few lines, handwritten on faded stationery. He always believed you'd outlast him. She'd written. He told me once, Raymond doesn't run out of strength. He just waits until the world remembers it owes him space to use it. Thank you for coming, for carrying all of them with you. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the empty velvet box on the desk. He didn't sleep right away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, unlaced his shoes, and looked down at them. The polish was still sharp. Not a single scuff from the day. They'd done their job. Tomorrow he would fly home. Not in the cockpit, not in 23C. This time in 1A. Morning came with a quiet knock. A uniformed aide offered coffee and a message. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs has requested a short meeting. If you are open to it, sir, she said there's no agenda. Just a wish to say thank you. Raymond looked up from his chair, nodded once and said on 10 minutes, oh, sorry, no more. The meeting took place in a private garden, quiet and walled in. The secretary didn't come with cameras. She didn't come with talking points, just a simple folder. Inside it were 4 letters each from one of the passengers on the flight, handwritten, raw. The first was from the pilot. He wrote, I used to think my job was just to fly people from point A to B, but flying you wasn't about distance, it was about memory. Thank you for reminding me why I put this uniform on. The second was from a woman in 14F. She wrote, I lost my brother in Afghanistan. I never met his unit commander. But watching you walk that aisle, I imagined what it would have meant if he'd made it home. Thank you for walking like it mattered. The third was from Kyle, the teenager who took the photo. I didn't mean for this to happen. He wrote, I just saw something that felt wrong and couldn't let it stay invisible. I hope I didn't offend you. I just wanted the world to see what I saw. The fourth was unsigned. Just a single line, you stood when we forgot how to. Raymond didn't speak for a while. Then, as the secretary stood to leave, he said, make sure they don't forget again. That's the only favor I want. Later that day, boarding was quick. No announcements, no priority call, just a quiet nod from the staff and an escort who didn't ask questions. As he settled into seat 1A, he looked out the window. The clouds were gathering again, soft and gray, but there was no turbulence forecasted. The pilot leaned in before takeoff. Would you like a moment up front again? Sir Raymond shook his head. I'm good here. The flight was smooth, routine, peaceful. But before they descended, something unexpected happened. The in-flight entertainment system paused, and for exactly 90 seconds, every screen displayed the same photo Raymond, seated at the gate, shoes polished, hat in lap. A small caption at the bottom read, Legacy travels quieter than fame, but when it walks by, the whole room feels it. No announcement followed, no explanation, just that image, that silence. When the plane touched down and Raymond walked through the airport in his home state, a man sweeping near baggage claim stood a little straighter, a TSA agent gave a slight nod, and a woman behind a coffee kiosk, without a word, placed a small cup on the counter and pushed it toward him. On it was written in black marker, for the one who carried them all. Raymond picked it up, tasted the coffee, and smiled. Just slightly. It was strong, like memory. The sun had nearly set when Raymond stepped out of the terminal. The airport doors hissed open behind him, and a mild breeze tugged softly at the edge of his blazer. The polished shoes that had once walked through rice paddies now pressed gently into the sidewalk outside Gate 3B, this time at a regional airport far from Washington, D.C. The ride home was waiting, a modest black SUV with a soft hum, driven by a quiet volunteer from the Veterans Center. The man greeted him with a respectful nod and said nothing else. Raymond liked it that way. The drive was uneventful, passing through stretches of farmland, small gas stations, and telephone lines that hung like lazy fishing rods above the road. Everything looked the same. And yet, nothing did. Inside his home, A small one-story cottage near the edge of town. The air was still. The furniture was arranged just as he'd left it: two wooden chairs, a table by the window, a bookshelf lined with war history, and a few tattered novels. On the mantel, a picture of Echo Recon 6 laminated, framed in oak. 8 boys in a moment of unearned joy, their arms slung around each other, grinning like they'd never have to bury one of their own. He stood in front of it for a moment longer than usual. Then he placed the velvet coin box back into the drawer beside the fireplace. The coin itself, however, he kept in his pocket. That night, he didn't sleep early. Sleep felt dishonest somehow, like ending a sentence before the thought had landed. So instead, he sat on the back porch with a cup of hot water, no tea, no sugar, and watched the stars emerge one by one. The crickets sang, the world exhaled, and the sky, for a moment, became a blanket stitched with names only he could see. In the days that followed, life returned to routine, or appeared to. He visited the town square each morning for coffee, nodded at the same cashier who now handed him the cup with both hands. He stopped by the library, returned a book he hadn't read, checked out another one he might never start. People didn't rush to shake his hand or ask for pictures. That would have made him retreat. But their eyes changed. When they saw him now, they looked longer, slower, as if learning how to see again. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a printed message, short and direct: Mr. Holt, if you're willing, we would like to record your memories. Not for headlines, not for a monument, but for preservation, for context, for the ones still learning what sacrifice sounds like. A mobile unit will be near your region next Thursday. No cameras, just a recorder and someone who listens well. He sat with the letter for a day, then another. On the third, he replied with 5 words: I'll come. But only once. The recording took place in a borrowed classroom at the community college. The interviewer was young, late 20s, soft-spoken, wearing a brown corduroy jacket and nervous hands. He called Raymond sir at first, until Raymond told him not to. The session lasted 2 hours. No script, just memory. They began with names, places, the sound of boots on wet soil, the weight of letters that arrived too late. The feeling of returning home to a country that clapped at the wrong times and forgot the rest. At one point, the interviewer asked a question he'd clearly been holding. Do you think they understand now? Raymond took a breath, slow and deliberate. Understanding isn't something that happens in a moment. It happens across generations. One photo, one flight, one whisper at a time. We didn't serve so they'd understand everything. We served so they'd have the freedom not to. The interviewer didn't respond. He just nodded, eyes lowered, fingers still. After the session, Raymond stepped outside into the cool light of late afternoon. There, sitting on the edge of a bench, was Kyle, the boy from the airport, now slightly older, hair a bit longer, posture less awkward. He stood when he saw Raymond, hands in his pockets, uncertain. I didn't want to come without asking. Kyle said, I heard you were talking today. I'm not here for an autograph or anything. Raymond looked at him, studied his face for the first time under natural light. You started something, he said. Kyle nodded. I didn't mean to. I couldn't walk past you like everyone else. Raymond motioned toward the bench. They both sat. For a while, neither spoke. Then Kyle pulled something from his pocket. A printed photo, grainy but powerful. It was the shot he'd taken at Gate 32. He'd laminated it. Below the image, in handwritten ink, he'd written, he waited. We arrived. I carry this now, Kyle said. To remember, to not look away. Raymond took the photo, held it briefly, then handed it back. Don't carry me. Carry what it means. Kyle looked down. I'm trying. They parted with a handshake, but something in the gesture felt generational, like a quiet handover of responsibility. That night, Raymond returned home and did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He opened a locked drawer in his bedroom and pulled out a dusty journal. Inside were entries written in careful block letters, starting in 1972 and ending sometime in the early 2000s. Pages filled with names, operations, quotes, and dates. He turned to a blank page and wrote November 18, 2025. For the first time in years, Someone looked long enough to ask why, and then stayed to hear the answer. He closed the book, placed it gently back into the drawer, and this time didn't lock it. A few weeks later, the local paper ran a small story not on the front page, not flashy, just a quiet column titled, "The Man Who Walked Like Memory." It included no quotes, no interviews, just a photograph of Raymond walking past the Arlington Stones. His shadow stretched between the rows, and somewhere in a classroom, a teacher read it aloud. Somewhere in a church, a pastor referenced it in a sermon about humility. Somewhere in a home where a father once served, a daughter looked up and asked, "Who was he?" And the answer, spoken softly by someone who knew how silence could carry weight, was he was the last one left. Until we remembered he never walked alone. Legacy, in the end, wasn't about statues or ceremonies. It was about echoes carried not by volume, but by truth. And when Raymond Holt passed 2 winters later, it was snowing gently outside. A nurse at the VA hospice whispered his name even after he'd gone, and at that very moment, an air traffic controller in D.C. looked up from his screen and paused just for a second because memory once awakened never truly sleeps again, and some footsteps, even when stilled, continue to walk beside us, always.